8-year-old Tommy Miller was teaching his dad how to skip stones by the creek when they both vanished from their campsite. The fire was still burning. Their hiking boots were still by the tent, but father and son had disappeared completely. 7 years of searching turned up nothing until rock climber Jake Morrison looked up during his ascent and saw their tent sitting 200 feet above him on an impossible ledge, completely dry, completely intact, completely unexplained. The morning of June 15th, 2012, started like any other weekend camping trip for David Miller and his 8-year-old son, Tommy. They had driven 3 hours from Denver to reach their favorite spot in Rocky Mountain National Park, a secluded campsite beside Clear Creek, surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs that stretched toward the Colorado sky. David was a careful man, a software engineer who planned everything down to the smallest detail. He had packed enough food for 4 days, checked the weather twice, and even brought backup batteries for their flashlights. Tommy, with his gap-toothed grin and boundless energy, had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It was their special time together, just father and son, away from the busy world of school and work and responsibilities. That Saturday morning, they woke to the sound of rushing water and birdsong. David started the campfire while Tommy explored the creek bank, collecting smooth stones in his small hands. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and mountain flowers. Everything was perfect. Around 10 in the morning, Tommy called out to his father with excitement. He had discovered the perfect skipping stone, flat, round, and smooth as glass. But there was just one problem. Tommy had never successfully skipped a stone across water. Every attempt ended with a disappointing plunk as the rock sank straight to the bottom. "Dad, can you teach me?" Tommy asked, holding up his treasure. David smiled and set down his coffee cup. This was exactly the kind of moment he had hoped for on their trip. Father and son walked to the creek's edge, where the water ran clear and calm over ancient stones. David knelt beside his boy, placing his larger hand over Tommy's small fingers. "It's all in the wrist," he said gently. "You want to throw it sideways like this?" He demonstrated the motion, and Tommy watched with intense concentration, his tongue poking out slightly as he focused. But what happened next would become one of Colorado's most baffling mysteries. The campfire continued to burn. David's coffee cup sat exactly where he had left it, still warm to the touch. Tommy's collection of stones remained scattered by the creek bank. Their hiking boots stood neatly side by side outside the tent, just as they had been arranged that morning. But David and Tommy Miller had vanished completely. When they failed to return home on Sunday evening, David's ex-wife, Sarah, called the park rangers. She knew David was responsible and punctual. He would never miss Tommy's soccer practice on Monday morning without calling. Something was terribly wrong. The initial search began at dawn on Monday. Park rangers found the campsite undisturbed, everything in its place. The fire had burned itself out naturally, leaving cold ashes. David's truck keys were still in his jacket pocket. Tommy's favorite stuffed animal lay in his sleeping bag, waiting for a boy who would never return. But there were no footprints leading away from the campsite. No signs of struggle. No indication that anyone had ever left that spot by the creek. It was as if father and son had simply stepped out of existence. Search teams expanded their efforts throughout the week. Dozens of volunteers combed the forest, calling their names until their voices echoed off the canyon walls. Helicopters circled overhead, their crews scanning every ridge and valley. Bloodhounds were brought in to follow any trace of scent, but even the dogs seemed confused, circling the campsite without picking up a trail. The FBI joined the investigation after the first week. They interviewed family members, friends, and coworkers. They examined David's finances, his phone records, his computer. They found a man with no enemies, no debts, no reason to disappear. David loved his son more than life itself. The idea that he would voluntarily walk away from Tommy was unthinkable to anyone who knew him. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. The missing persons posters that once covered every surface in nearby towns began to fade and curl at the edges. The reward fund, started by Sarah and supported by the community, sat untouched. There were simply no leads to follow, no clues to pursue. The only mystery was the complete absence of any mystery at all. No ransom demands, no bodies, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where they might have gone or why they had left. David and Tommy Miller had become ghosts in their own story. As the first anniversary of their disappearance approached, the active search was officially suspended. The case remained open, but investigators had exhausted every possible lead. Family members held a memorial service beside Clear Creek, the same spot where father and son had last been seen. Sarah brought flowers, daisies for Tommy, who had always loved picking them for her. Years passed. The campsite was used by other families, other fathers teaching other children to skip stones across the clear mountain water. Park rangers would occasionally mention the Miller case to each other, usually when training new recruits. It had become part of the park's unofficial folklore, the mystery that nobody could solve. But mysteries have a way of revealing themselves when you least expect it. Jake Morrison was 26 years old and had been climbing for most of his life. He was attempting a new route up Devil's Tower, a notorious granite face that had challenged climbers for decades. The cliff was known for its technical difficulty and unpredictable weather. Even experienced climbers avoided it unless conditions were absolutely perfect. On the morning of September 23, 2019, exactly 7 years and 3 months after the Millers vanished, Jake was making good progress up the rock face. The sun was bright, the wind was calm, and he was feeling confident about completing the route before afternoon storms rolled in. He was about halfway up the cliff when he paused to rest and check his equipment. Climbing at this level required constant attention to safety. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, could mean death. As he secured himself to the rock face, Jake happened to glance upward to plan his next sequence of moves. That's when he saw something that made him question his own eyes. About 50 feet above him and slightly to the right, sitting on what appeared to be an impossibly narrow ledge, was a tent. Not the remains of a tent, not pieces of fabric that had somehow blown up the cliff face, but a complete, intact, perfectly normal camping tent. Jake stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The tent was bright blue with yellow trim, clearly visible against the gray granite. It sat upright and properly staked, as if someone had simply pitched it there for the night. But that was impossible. The ledge was barely 3 feet wide and sloped at a dangerous angle. Even if someone could have reached it, no sane person would try to camp there. Jake pulled out his phone and snapped several photos, though he doubted anyone would believe what he had captured. He studied the images on his small screen, zooming in on the tent. There were no ropes leading to it, no climbing equipment visible. It simply sat there, defying logic and gravity. The more Jake looked at the tent, the more unsettling it became. The fabric appeared to be in perfect condition, no fading from sun exposure, no weathering from years of mountain storms. The stakes were still firmly planted in cracks in the rock. Even the door flap was properly zipped closed. It looked like someone had pitched it yesterday. Jake completed his climb in record time, driven by a mixture of excitement and unease. As soon as he reached cell phone coverage, he called the park ranger station. The dispatcher who answered listened skeptically to his story. Rangers received dozens of calls each year from hikers claiming to have found evidence related to the Miller case. Most turned out to be wishful thinking or mistaken identity. But Jake's photos were different. The tent in the images was clearly real, clearly impossible, and clearly something that needed immediate investigation. Ranger Patricia Williams had been working at Rocky Mountain National Park for 15 years. She remembered the Miller case well. It had been one of the most intensive search efforts in the park's history. When she saw Jake's photos, her first thought was that someone was playing an elaborate prank. But the more she studied the images, the more convinced she became that this was something significant. The problem was reaching the tent. The ledge where it sat was accessible only to expert climbers with specialized equipment. Even then, it would be a dangerous operation. Patricia contacted the county sheriff's office and requested assistance from their technical rescue team. 3 days later, Deputy Sheriff Mike Chen, Sarah's brother and an experienced mountaineer, led a team up Devil's Tower. The climb took them 6 hours, moving slowly and carefully up the treacherous rock face. When they finally reached the ledge, what they found defied all explanation. The tent was indeed perfectly preserved. The blue nylon showed no signs of weathering, no fading from ultraviolet exposure. The zippers worked smoothly. The aluminum stakes were free of corrosion. Inside, they found 2 sleeping bags, a camp stove, and a small collection of smooth stones, the kind a child might gather from a creek bed. But there were no human remains, no clothing, no identification, no clear proof that this tent had belonged to David and Tommy Miller, though the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The tent was the same brand and color that David had purchased for their camping trips. The sleeping bags matched the ones reported missing. The stones were identical to those Tommy had been collecting by Clear Creek. Mike Chen had prepared himself for many possibilities during the ascent, but not this. As he knelt on the narrow ledge and examined the tent's contents, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. 7 years of weathering should have reduced the tent to tatters. 7 years of snow, rain, wind, and sun should have bleached the fabric and corroded the metal. Instead, everything looked as if it had been placed there yesterday. The technical team carefully documented everything before packing the tent and its contents for transport back to the ground. The operation took most of the day, and by the time they rappelled back to the base of the cliff, word had already spread to the local media. The Miller case was front-page news once again. Sarah Miller, now Sarah Chen after remarrying, drove to the park as soon as she heard. She identified the tent immediately. It was the same one David had been so proud of when he bought it, calling it their adventure headquarters. She recognized the small repair patch near the door where Tommy had accidentally poked it with a stick. She knew the way David had always arranged the sleeping bags, his on the left side, Tommy's on the right. But identification raised more questions than it answered. How had the tent reached that ledge? David had been an experienced hiker, but had never shown interest in technical climbing. He didn't own ropes or climbing equipment. The ledge where the tent was found required skills and gear that neither David nor 8-year-old Tommy possessed. More puzzling still was the tent's condition. Sarah had expected to find weathered remains, if anything at all. Instead, the tent looked exactly as it had on that June morning 7 years earlier. The fabric was supple, the colors bright. Even the small stains from previous camping trips were still visible. Forensic experts from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation examined every inch of the tent and its contents. They found David's fingerprints on the camp stove and Tommy's small handprints on the sleeping bag. DNA analysis confirmed that both father and son had spent time inside the tent, but there were no clues about how it had reached its impossible perch or what had happened to the people who had once slept there. The stones were perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery. Tommy had collected exactly 17 of them, each one carefully selected for its potential as a skipping stone. They were arranged in a small pile beside his sleeping bag, as if he had been saving them for another attempt at the creek. One stone was different from the others, perfectly round, smooth as glass, with tiny flecks of mica that caught the light. It was exactly the kind of stone a boy would consider a treasure. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a geologist from the University of Colorado, examined the stones at the request of the sheriff's department. Her analysis revealed something unexpected. While 16 of the stones were common granite from Clear Creek, one, the special round stone, was composed of a rare mineral formation not found anywhere in Rocky Mountain National Park. In fact, it didn't match any geological samples from Colorado at all. The discovery of the tent reopened the Miller case, but investigators found themselves with more questions than ever. They could now prove that David and Tommy had been inside that tent on the cliff ledge, but they couldn't explain how the tent had gotten there or what had happened to the two people who had slept in it. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts, missing persons experts, and even a specialist in unusual disappearances. They developed dozens of theories. Maybe David had secretly learned climbing skills and had planned to disappear with Tommy. Maybe someone else had moved the tent after finding it elsewhere. Maybe the tent had been blown to the ledge by freak weather conditions. But every theory fell apart under scrutiny. David's financial records showed no purchases of climbing equipment. His computer history revealed no searches for climbing techniques or remote locations. Friends and co-workers insisted he had never mentioned any interest in rock climbing. The weather records for the week of their disappearance showed no storm strong enough to lift a tent and deposit it so precisely on a narrow ledge. And then there was the condition of the tent itself. No natural force could have preserved the fabric so perfectly for 7 years. No weather event could have arranged the contents so neatly inside. The case attracted national attention. Television documentaries explored every angle of the mystery. Internet forums buzzed with amateur theories ranging from the plausible to the bizarre. Some suggested supernatural explanations. Others proposed government cover-ups. A few claimed to have seen David and Tommy in foreign countries, living under assumed names. But for Sarah Chen, the speculation and theories were just noise. She had her brother Mike drive her to Devil's Tower, where she stood at the base of the cliff and stared up at the ledge where the tent had been found. She tried to imagine David and Tommy up there, tried to picture how they might have reached that impossible place. But imagination failed her. The one thing that gave her a small measure of comfort was Tommy's collection of stones. She remembered how excited he would get when he found a perfect skipping stone, how he would examine it from every angle before adding it to his collection. The fact that he had carefully gathered 17 stones suggested that he had been happy in those final moments by Clear Creek, focused on something he loved. The special stone, the one that didn't belong to Rocky Mountain National Park, became a particular focus of investigation. Dr. Hartwell expanded her analysis, comparing the mineral composition to samples from around the world. After months of work, she made a startling discovery. The stone matched formations found in only one place on Earth, a remote valley in Tibet, accessible only by a treacherous mountain pass that few people had ever attempted. This finding raised even more impossible questions. How had an 8-year-old boy in Colorado come to possess a stone from Tibet? Had someone given it to him? Had he found it somewhere else before their camping trip? Sarah was certain she had never seen the stone before, and David had never mentioned traveling to Tibet or receiving any gifts from that part of the world. The investigation gradually wound down as leads dried up and new cases demanded attention. The tent and its contents were returned to Sarah, who stored them in her garage, unable to bear looking at them, but unwilling to throw them away. The special stone from Tibet sat on her kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light just as it had caught Tommy's attention 7 years earlier. Occasionally, climbers attempting Devil's Tower would report strange sounds echoing off the rock face, a child's laughter, a man's voice calling encouragement. Park rangers dismissed these reports as audio tricks played by wind and stone, but the stories persisted. Some climbers began avoiding the route altogether, claiming the cliff felt wrong somehow. Jake Morrison returned to Devil's Tower several times over the following years, but he never again saw anything unusual on the ledge where the tent had been found. The spot looked exactly as it should, a narrow shelf of granite, too small and dangerous for camping, too remote for casual visits. Sometimes, when the light was just right, he thought he could see slight indentations in the rock where tent stakes might have been placed. But he couldn't be certain. The Miller case became a cautionary tale among climbers and hikers. Safety experts used it as an example of how quickly people could vanish in the wilderness, even experienced outdoorsmen who took proper precautions. But they couldn't explain the tent on the impossible ledge or why it had remained perfectly preserved for 7 years. 5 years after the tent's discovery, Sarah Chen made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She packed David's climbing gear she had never known he owned, into the same blue tent where it had been found, and she donated everything to a local youth climbing program. She kept only one item, Tommy's special stone from Tibet. "I used to think I needed answers," she told Mike as they loaded the tent into his truck. "I used to believe that if I could just understand what happened, I could find some kind of peace. But I realize now that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some questions don't have answers that we can understand." She paused, turning the smooth stone over in her hands. Maybe David and Tommy found something that the rest of us aren't ready to see yet. Maybe that tent sitting on an impossible ledge was exactly where it was supposed to be. The youth climbing program used David's equipment to teach dozens of children the basics of rock climbing. The tent became part of their gear rotation, providing shelter for young climbers on their first overnight expeditions. In a strange way, it continued to serve its original purpose, bringing fathers and sons, mothers and daughters together in the wilderness, creating memories that would last a lifetime. But questions lingered. Park rangers still received occasional reports from climbers who claimed to see figures on high ledges where no humans should be able to reach. Hikers along Clear Creek sometimes found perfectly smooth stones arranged in small piles, as if someone had been practicing for the perfect skip across the water. The case files remain open in both the Sheriff's Department and FBI offices. Every few years, a new investigator reviews the evidence, hoping to find something previous analysts missed. They study the photographs of the impossible tent, analyze the mysterious stone from Tibet, read through hundreds of witness statements and expert reports. But the conclusion is always the same. David and Tommy Miller vanished from a creekside campsite in Rocky Mountain National Park, and 7 years later, their tent was found in a place where it could not possibly have been placed by human hands. Dr. Hartwell kept a photograph of Tommy's special stone on her desk throughout her career. Students would sometimes ask about it, and she would tell them the story of the boy who collected rocks and the tent that defied gravity. She would use it as a lesson about the limits of scientific knowledge, about the humility required in the face of true mystery. "We like to think we understand the world around us," she would say, holding up the photograph. "We believe that every question has an answer, every mystery has a solution. But sometimes the universe reminds us how little we actually know. Sometimes the most honest thing we can say is simply, 'I don't know.'" The stone from Tibet remained on Sarah's windowsill for years, catching the light each morning like a small beacon. She would hold it sometimes while drinking her coffee, remembering Tommy's excitement when he found it, remembering David's patient voice as he taught his son to skip stones across Clear Creek. On quiet mornings, when the light hit the stone just right, she could almost hear their voices carried on the mountain wind, a father's gentle instruction, a boy's delighted laughter, the sound of stones skipping across still water. She never tried to explain these moments to anyone else. Some experiences were too precious, too fragile to survive the weight of words. The mystery of David and Tommy Miller became part of Rocky Mountain National Park's enduring legends, passed down from ranger to ranger, from climber to climber, from one generation of visitors to the next. It reminded everyone who heard it that the wilderness still held secrets, that despite all our technology and knowledge, there were still places where the impossible could happen. And on certain quiet mornings by Clear Creek, when the mist rises from the water and the light filters through the pine trees just so, visitors sometimes report seeing two figures by the water's edge. A tall man kneeling beside a small boy, both of them focused intently on the ancient art of skipping stones across a mountain stream. But when these witnesses approach for a closer look, they find only smooth stones scattered on the bank and the eternal sound of water flowing over granite, carrying its secrets toward the distant peaks where eagles soar and tents sometimes appear on impossible ledges, defying explanation and challenging everything we think we know about the world. The tent, the stones, the voices on the wind, they all became part of the mountain's mystery, reminders that some questions exist not to be answered, but to keep us humble before the vast unknowns that surround us. In the end, perhaps that was David and Tommy's greatest gift to the world, the reminder that mystery itself has value, that wonder is worth preserving, and that some of the most important truths can only be felt, never fully explained. To this day, no one knows how their tent appeared on a ledge 200 feet up a sheer cliff face, or why it remained perfectly preserved for 7 years in one of Colorado's harshest environments. The special stone from Tibet still sits on Sarah's windowsill, and Clear Creek still flows past their abandoned campsite, where the fire pit remains as a quiet monument to a father's love and a boy's endless curiosity about the world around him. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries are the ones that remind us there's still magic left in the world. 3 years after Sarah donated the tent to the youth climbing program, something happened that would add another layer to the Miller mystery. Marcus Chen, Sarah's 15-year-old nephew, was part of a group using the tent during a climbing expedition. That night, he woke to hear voices outside, a father teaching his son to skip stones, the same conversation witnesses had reported for years. When Marcus told his father Mike about the incident, the deputy sheriff realized these weren't isolated reports. At least 30 people had heard similar conversations near water throughout the park. More disturbing were the reports of children briefly disappearing during family trips, only to return with perfect collections of skipping stones and stories of meeting the boy who knows all the best rocks. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist specializing in missing persons cases, documented 17 such incidents over 3 years. In every case, children described the same gap-toothed boy and his patient father teaching them to listen to the rocks and feel which ones want to fly. Unlike typical trauma cases, these children seemed enriched by their experiences, returning with new confidence and deeper connections to nature. The encounters followed a pattern centered around Devil's Tower, but extending throughout the park, always near water sources where stones could be skipped. They occurred most frequently during late spring and early summer, the same time of year David and Tommy had disappeared. Local Native American elders offered their own perspective. "Some people don't cross over completely," explained Ute elder Joseph Running Bear. "They stay in the places that held their hearts, especially if they died with something important left undone. Maybe this father and son had more teaching to do." A breakthrough came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a seismologist who discovered unusual readings from the day of the Miller disappearance. On June 15, 2012, instruments had detected a brief seismic anomaly unlike anything in the geological record. Weather stations recorded electromagnetic disturbances, wildlife fled the area, and satellite imagery showed atmospheric disruption over the exact location where the tent was later found. "It's as if something opened and closed in that specific location," Dr. Tanaka explained. "The readings suggest a brief disruption in normal physical laws, lasting approximately 7 minutes and 33 seconds. 7 minutes and 33 seconds. Long enough for David and Tommy to walk to the creek. Long enough for a father to teach his son to skip a perfect stone. Long enough for something extraordinary to occur." But what that something might have been remained beyond conventional understanding. The encounters continued. Children disappearing briefly and returning with perfect stones. Climbers hearing voices echo off cliff faces. Hikers finding mysterious stone arrangements by mountain streams. As the 10th anniversary approached, Sarah Chen made a decision that surprised everyone. She would spend the night alone at the original campsite, using the same blue tent found on the impossible ledge, hoping to experience whatever her family had encountered a decade earlier. "I need to know," she told Mike. "If there's even the smallest possibility that they're still out there somehow, I have to try to find them." Mike tried to dissuade her, but Sarah's mind was made up. On June 15, 2022, exactly 10 years after David and Tommy's disappearance, she drove to Rocky Mountain National Park with the blue tent that had defied explanation for so long. The rangers weren't sure if it was a good idea. The original campsite had turned into a kind of shrine, a place where curious travelers and grieving families came to stand in silence, hoping to feel something. The Miller mystery had grown beyond a missing persons case. It was folklore. And now Sarah wanted to camp there herself. Officials worried about her state of mind, but she had all the paperwork, and she promised to keep the radio on. As evening settled, she set up her tent on the exact patch of ground where David and Tommy had slept 10 years before. The old fire pit was still there, stones blackened in the same circle David had built. The creek still ran beside her, the same gentle sound that had been the backdrop to her last morning with them. She made a small dinner but couldn't eat. Every flicker of shadow felt like a sign. Every rustle from the trees made her chest tighten. She thought she'd feel closer to them here. Instead, she felt the crushing weight of absence. Then, just past midnight, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. Sarah froze. Her radio crackled to life. "Sarah, are you okay?" It was Mike at the ranger station, 2 miles away. "I'm picking up movement on thermal." She unzipped the flap, heart racing, but the clearing was empty. The sound was gone. Only the creek whispered. Hours later, at 3:17 a.m., it came again. Voices, not strangers, familiar ones. A father's patient instruction, a boy's eager response. "It's not about throwing hard. Find the right angle." Sarah's breath caught. That was David's voice. And Tommy's reply. Still high, still young. She stepped out. The moon lit the creek, and there they were. David, unchanged, wearing the same flannel shirt. Tommy, still 8 years old, still gap-toothed, still holding his stones. They looked real, solid, alive. "Tommy," she whispered, louder. "David." They didn't respond. They kept playing, father teaching son. But then Tommy looked up. He smiled, her boy's smile, and waved. Sarah stumbled toward them, splashing through the water. But when she reached the bank, there was only moonlight on stone. The voices were gone. The air was still. On the ground lay 17 stones, arranged in the careful pattern she remembered from the tent. She touched them with trembling fingers. They were warm, and one was different. The Tibetan stone, the same one investigators had puzzled over for years. It glowed faintly, as if alive. She clutched it to her chest. For a moment, she swore she felt her son's presence, heard his whisper, "The stones remember everything." That night stretched on in silence, but Sarah no longer felt alone. The air around her seemed charged, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She thought of all the children who had vanished and returned with perfect stones, of the voices climbers swore they heard echoing off impossible cliffs. Maybe it hadn't been coincidence. Maybe the mountain had always been keeping something safe. Memories, moments, fragments of love too powerful to fade. With the glowing stone pressed against her heart, Sarah felt less like she had lost her family and more like she had finally glimpsed where they had gone. At sunrise, rangers found her by the creek, calm and radiant, the stones set in a circle around her. "They're okay," she told Mike. "They found something beautiful. They're still teaching." Sarah never spoke publicly again, but she donated the glowing stone to the visitor center. The plaque beneath it reads, "Some mysteries are gifts." And still, hikers tell stories. Children vanish and return with perfect stones. Voices echo where no one should be. A tent waits on its impossible ledge. And on certain mornings, when the mist rises over Clear Creek, some swear they see them, father and son, forever teaching, forever preserved in the mountain's silence.